Well, welcome to the MAM journals, and as you can see today we're going to be reviewing the Triumph Thruxton, and I'll also be taking the opportunity to compare it to the Kawasaki Z900RS, as I think that's the bike that a number of people consider when they're looking at buying one or the other. So I'm going to be covering the history of the bike, and it's a retrospective, so I think it's appropriate that we go back and say, well, what was its original story? And I'll then be doing a technical walk around, so I'll be talking about the specifications, and then I will be very clearly comparing it with the Kawasaki, and then finally I'll be talking about my personal reflections. A friend of mine lent me the bike, and I've had the privilege of having a couple of hundred miles on it, so I've now got a view about what its strengths and what its weaknesses are in comparison to other bikes. So let's go back to the history. The Triumph, actually, Thruxton was first developed in the mid-60s really. 1964 was when they really began serious work on it. And it was called the Thruxton because it was targeted to run in longer distance races, and Thruxton, which is an old World War II airfield in the south of the UK, for those of you not watching from here, but had been converted to racing, and they held a race called the Thruxton 500, and in those racing years it was quite important to show not only the speed of your bikes but how reliable they were over time. As technology nowadays has improved, we all expect our bikes to actually do exactly what it says in the tin, but in the 60s some bikes were significantly less reliable than others, and so therefore that was a big selling point, showing that you can actually do 500-mile plus races. So they built it for that purpose, and they enjoyed significant success, and they actually won races at Brands, the Isle of Man, and ironically in 1965 the actual Thruxton 500 race was held, but not at Thruxton. It was held at a circuit called Castle Combe, and it won that race. So it did have a successful career. It was actually based, as a bike, it was based on the T120 Bonneville, which is a 649cc bike. It was a twin with overhead valves, and a standard Bonnie produced 46 brake horsepower, while the tuned Thruxton produced 54. So it was a significant increase in power, and as I say, it was successful. Why did they race them? As I say, demonstrate reliability, get brand awareness, and promote sales. And I have to say, it's perhaps not coincidental that the Bonneville in 1965 sold 28,000 units in the States. So it certainly was a very well-known brand, and the Thruxton was a key part of their marketing campaign. So a good bike. Now, anybody who's followed Triumph for any length of time will know that as a company it's had more comebacks than Lazarus, and its recent incarnation launched a new Bonneville in 2001, which was an 865 air-cooled carburettor bike, and in 2003 they decided they're going to revisit the Thruxton history and launched a retrospective bike at that point. I bought one of those in 2003, and I can tell you from personal experience that it was a nice looking bike, but clip-ons, swept up exhausts, but very basic suspension and no enhancement to the standard power, and it wasn't a bike you'd want to ride very fast, because it very quickly tied itself into a knot. So if you've got one, I apologise, but my advice can only be it's probably better to polish it than to actually ride it. So I was actually delighted when I saw in 2016 they'd had another go at a Thruxton that was more in keeping with its proper heritage. And this bike is a nice handling bike, and we'll be talking about that as we do a technical walk around. Okay, the first thing I'd bring to your attention is the height of the handlebar arrangement, which, if I get back that, you can see actually they're remarkably level. Despite the appearance of clip-ons, they're not, I wouldn't describe them as clip-ons, I would describe them as clip-ups. if you look where they go there and how that angle works, and I think that's quite cleverly done. I think it gives you the feeling of a retrospective cafe racer without the discomfort of the real thing. And if I just show you something here, this is a Suzuki GSX-R 750, 140 brake horsepower, 170 mile an hour bike, so a proper on sports bike, and you can see that they're clip-ons, and it takes your hands downwards, not upwards. And I think it's worth it. The discomfort of that, because it is less comfortable than the higher bars, is worth it for the performance of the bike. But this is a retrospective, and it's not designed to be a track bike. Designed to be a fun bike that you enjoy looking at and rides well, and indeed it does. So if I just talk through the components, because I think one of the nice things about this Triumph Thruxton is the quality of the components, beautifully put together. Their Shower 43mm big piston forks, Brembos at the brakes, twin discs, and also Öhlins fully adjustable piggyback shocks at the back, and I think that goes a long way to explaining the nearly £2,000 differential in pricing. Those components are not cheap. And some very nice finishes if you're into keeping your bikes clean, and I do enjoy that. It is a very rewarding bike to polish up and clean, but I think you'd have to keep on top of it. I was quite surprised actually, I don't know if you can see those, but it's just beginning to get some pitting. And on this beautiful top yoke here, this chrome finish, you can see it's already marked up a bit. So I think if you buy this because you like the finish of it, you'd probably have to keep on top of it quite a lot in terms of what you did with it. Right, let's talk about the engine. This is a 1200cc, liquid cooled, nice thin radiator there. Twin, single overhead cam, produces 97 brake horsepower, and I don't normally mention torque figures, but I will on this bike because it's relevant. It produces 113 newton meters of torque at about 4,500 revs. Now, if I compare that directly to the Kawasaki, that's 109 brake horsepower and produces 98.5 newton meters of torque at 6,500, and that changes the riding characteristics, which I'll touch on later. Certainly you get access to power very quickly on that, whilst you have to work a bit harder to get it out of the Kawasaki, but it's definitely got it. In terms of weight, they're both virtually identical, 472 pounds versus 473 pounds. I do get a bit frustrated with manufacturers. They talk about dry weight, wet weight, curb weights and all sorts of things, but I think that's probably like for like comparison. Electronics, very similar in electronics. Both bikes are fitted with ABS, which is now obviously a legal requirement in the UK, and you can switch them off, and they're adjustable in terms of traction. This one's also got, I think these dials are very nice, very in keeping with a 60s retrospective. You can see it's got road on there. You've actually got another mode to the left of that, which you can cycle through, which is rain. And then on the right side of that, you have another mode, which is sports. Anybody who knows me will know immediately that I spent most of my time in sports, and it's good fun. This Le Mans style cap is a nice bit of fun. It's not, of course it isn't, there's a locking cap underneath there, just like that. So in terms of performance, what do they actually do? Well, this bike, I saw in Bike Magazine, had been estimated at 130 miles an hour. It doesn't feel like that when you ride it, if I'm honest. It feels more like 120 something, but I'm sure it could get to 130, but you might need either a hill or a calendar to time it, because you might be waiting a while. This bike, I've now seen road tests on it. I said in my original view it's a 140 mile an hour bike. I've now seen a road test on it, properly tested, standard bike, two-way at a circuit, 143 miles an hour. So there's no question that this Kawasaki is ultimately a faster bike than the Norton. Other thing I think I should perhaps bring to your attention, as it's relevant in terms of riding it, these little mirrors, I at first thought, ooh, they'll just be styling accessories, and we'll be looking backwards most of the time, but I was perhaps being a bit unkind. They are functional and they are clear, but you do have to glance downwards when you actually want to use them. Well, obviously the more traditional upright, anybody who's got one of these will know these are very, very easy to use. You can get them through your peripheral vision. You don't have to turn your head, which I quite like on a road. I think it's quite useful. Just as a small aside, if you want truly useless mirrors, then you really need to buy the Experiencer Ducati and a set of those, as you will spend your entire riding life looking at the side of your elbows. I've no doubt I will get an email from Angry of Andover telling me that theirs are perfect, but I've had 7 of these and I've never seen anything but my elbows. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the review. So what did I think of the bike? It's actually more comfortable to ride than you might think at first glance. I think it's been quite clever what they've done with this riding position and avoiding the clip-ons, which, as I touched on earlier, I think would actually be a retrograde step in terms of what it's actually capable of doing. I think some of the component quality is very high, and I think there's a lot of satisfaction to be had out of a bike that's put together as nicely as this one. And in particular, I think the suspension is significantly better than that of the Kawasaki. And you can tell it on the road. It copes with bumps, ripples, and the uneven road surface that we, over in the UK, we call roads. It certainly copes with those well. It turns nicely. Feels a bit heavy on the turn, and it feels a heavier bike to actually ride than a bike of comparable weight. But I think that's down to where the weight position is and where your body is in terms of dealing with it. But one of the impressive characteristics is the torque, which I actually, for the first time in any of my videos, mentioned the torque numbers in the review. And the reason why I mention it is it makes a big difference on this particular bike. This is a bike that you can approach vehicles at road legal speeds which you wish to overtake, and you can just roll the throttle in 6th, and this bike will just overtake them effortlessly. It's that torque is really what this bike is all about in terms of performance. It runs out of steam quicker than the Kawasaki, and although I think in the early stages the Kawasaki will be hard pushed to keep up with it, later on there's no doubt in my mind that of the two, the Kawasaki would pull away. So I enjoyed riding it. I don't think it's quite as comfortable a bike overall as the Kawasaki, and because of that I don't think it's quite got the flexibility. I think you'd have to be in a special sort of mood to want to ride this. I've spoken to a couple of owners because I did actually probably more than 200 miles around, and I stopped at a couple of sort of cafes for a cup of tea, and you do see them out, and I took the opportunity to ask people what they thought of them, and actually I spoke to 3 people, and 3 of them, all 3 said they like to do about 100 miles, and I think that's probably because the riding position and the weight of the bike, and the fact that it's naked, it's not a particularly comfortable bike to ride, but it is a good bike, and I'm delighted that I liked it, because as I touched on earlier, really, I didn't think the 2003 reincarnation really did the Triumph Thruxton brand many favours, and I think this is nicely reflected on it. It's not the ultimate performance bike the original Thruxton was. The Thruxton, of course, when it's racing, would probably be nearly as fast as this, because obviously a race bike, you gear it up for whatever circuit you're on, depending on the length of the straight and the gearing. It wouldn't surprise me if the original Thruxton could do the 130 mile an hour that this actually does with 1200 cc's. But of course the bike was, the original Thruxton just was amazingly light. It was 360 something pounds. When you compare that to 400 and something, 70 something, that this is. So it just shows you how time has added some advantages and taken some away. But I think it's a good bike, and I can certainly understand why people would buy a Thruxton. Personally, of the two, I think on balance, I'm pleased with my Kawasaki. I think it's got the flexibility that I want. I can ride effortlessly on it. Probably an easier bike to ride than this one. And when you want to crack on, it's actually got that little bit extra performance. But one thing I have learnt from riding this, and I do respect for it, some of you may have watched my original Z900RS, where I sort of comment that I'm not convinced about the rear suspension. And riding this, I'm definitely not convinced about the Kawasaki's rear suspension, and it's convinced me that I need to do something about that to get the handling back to the level of something like this, while giving me all the benefits of the Kawasaki. I do hope you've enjoyed the review, and if you have, if you've been kind enough to press like, because it just gives me some feedback. I'm not a commercial channel, but it's nice to know that people are enjoying them, getting something from them, and make any comments that you wish, or indeed tell me any of the bikes you'd like me to cover. Thank you very much for watching.